There is a restaurant in your town that has been open longer than you have been alive. You probably drove past it last week without thinking twice. The parking lot looked the same, the sign was still lit. But sometime in the last few months, quietly and without much announcement, it stopped being what it used to be. Some of the most recognizable names in American dining, chains that fed entire generations, places where families celebrated birthdays and grabbed breakfast on Sunday mornings, are disappearing from the map one location at a time. Today we are looking at 12 beloved American family restaurant chains that are quietly closing forever. Number 12. Red Lobster. The restaurant that made a Tuesday night feel like a celebration just filed for bankruptcy and has been closing locations ever since. And the reason it collapsed will genuinely surprise you. For millions of American families, Red Lobster was never just a seafood restaurant. It was the restaurant you saved for the moments that deserved something better than a drive-thru. Graduations, promotions, birthdays. The Cheddar Bay biscuits alone became so embedded in American culture that people who hadn't visited in a decade could still describe the taste from memory. That kind of loyalty takes generations to build. What destroyed it took far less time. In 2020, Thai Union, the world's largest seafood supplier, took full control of Red Lobster. The restaurant was now owned by the company selling it its own ingredients. Seafood costs went up, margins collapsed. Then, in 2023, management made endless shrimp a permanent menu item. Red Lobster lost $20 million in a single quarter from that decision alone. Over 100 locations closed before the Chapter 11 bankruptcy filing in May 2024. Hundreds more followed. The chain that once made ordinary nights feel special is now a shrinking operation carrying the weight of decisions its loyal customers never had any say in. Number 11. Applebee's. Dozens of Applebee's locations across the South locked their doors in 2026 without warning, and the employees who showed up for their shifts found out the same way the customers did, standing in an empty parking lot. Applebee's built its entire identity around one honest idea: a neighborhood restaurant where the food was familiar, the prices were fair, and nobody had to dress up or pretend it was something it wasn't. That simplicity worked for decades. The problem was that Applebee's runs almost entirely on a franchise model, which means the corporate brand depends on hundreds of independent operators to actually keep the lights on. When those operators hit financial trouble, the restaurants close whether the corporate office is ready or not. In early 2026, a major franchisee operating more than 50 locations across Florida, Georgia, and Alabama filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy and immediately began shuttering restaurants. Locations near Disney World, near Daytona, near communities that had built weekly habits around those specific restaurants for years. Employees arrived for shifts and found locked doors. Customers drove into empty parking lots with no explanation on the window. The neighborhood restaurant that spent decades advertising community and belonging could not protect the very locations that community depended on because the business model it runs on was never designed to require it. Number 10. Denny's. A chain that proudly called itself America's Diner and kept its lights on 24 hours a day for decades, just closed more than 150 locations, and the towns that lost their only all-night diner have nothing waiting to replace it. Denny's held a position in American life that almost no other restaurant could claim. It was always open. 3 in the morning after a long drive. Christmas Day. A Sunday breakfast when cooking felt like too much effort. The Grand Slam. The bottomless coffee. A menu that never tried to surprise you, and a price that almost anyone could afford. At its peak, the chain operated more than 1,600 locations. The decline was gradual until it wasn't. Inflation drove food costs up. Labor shortages pushed wages higher in markets where franchisees were already operating on razor-thin margins. The customer who had always counted on Denny's as the affordable option started doing the math differently at the register. In late 2024, the company announced it would permanently close 150 of its lowest-performing restaurants by the end of 2025. The closures were complete by December. More locations disappeared into 2026. A brand that built its entire identity around being the restaurant that was always there, formally announced that for a significant portion of America, it would no longer be there at all. Number 9. Shoney's. A breakfast institution that once fed families across 34 states and operated more than 1,300 restaurants is now down to 58 locations, and an entire generation of Americans has grown up without ever knowing it existed. In the 1980s, Shoney's was not a regional chain. It was a national institution. The breakfast bar was its signature, a self-serve spread of eggs, biscuits, gravy, and fresh strawberry pie that entire families planned their weekend mornings around. In communities across the South and Midwest, it wasn't one of several options. It was the place. The specific restaurant that every family had a specific memory attached to, At its peak in 1998, Shoney's operated 1,300 restaurants across 34 states. Then ownership changes fragmented the operation. The buffet model that had been its greatest strength became a financial liability as food costs rose and consumer habits shifted. Maintaining a full spread across every meal period became impossible to staff and supply at a profit. The contraction that followed was so gradual it never made national headlines. Locations simply stopped existing in markets where they had been fixtures for 20 years. Today, 58 restaurants remain, concentrated in 4 southern states. From 1,300 locations across 34 states to 58 in 4 represents a 95% collapse of everything the brand had built. The people who remember Shoney's in its prime remember something genuinely significant. Everyone who came after them largely has no idea what was lost. Number 8. Bob Evans. A restaurant that built its entire identity around food that tasted like something your grandmother actually made is quietly closing locations in 2026, while the farm that gave it its name was sold off to someone who never worked a single shift inside one of its kitchens. Bob Evans started as a sausage farm in Rio Grande, Ohio in 1948 and grew into a restaurant chain that sold one completely honest idea: farmhouse food made with real ingredients by people who understood what that meant. Biscuits and gravy, mashed potatoes, farm-fresh eggs, the kind of breakfast that made you feel like someone had actually cooked it for you. At its height, the chain operated nearly 550 locations across the Midwest and Southeast. Then in 2017, the company sold its restaurant division to Golden Gate Capital, a private equity firm, while keeping the packaged foods operation. The restaurant was separated from the farm that had given it meaning and handed to a management structure that had no connection to a single row of Ohio farmland. By 2025, approximately 500 locations remained. Closures continued into 2026, with restaurants disappearing from Indiana, Florida, and Ohio, the state where the whole thing began. A chain born in Ohio farmland is now closing Ohio locations under ownership that never had any attachment to what the brand originally meant. The farmhouse feeling was never something a private equity balance sheet was designed to protect. Number 7. Howard Johnson's, a restaurant chain that once had more locations than McDonald's, defined American highway dining for an entire generation, and served 28 flavors of ice cream at 1,000 roadside stops across the country, closed its very last restaurant in 2022, and almost nobody in America noticed it was gone. In the 1960s, Howard Johnson's was not simply a successful chain. It was the dominant feature of American road trip culture. More than 1,000 orange-roofed restaurants lined the interstate highway system at the exact moment the interstate highway system was being built for the kind of long-distance family travel that Howard Johnson's existed to serve. The design was intentional. The orange roof was meant to be spotted from the highway at speed so that a family could make the decision to pull off before the exit appeared. The 28 flavors of ice cream were a specific and memorable promise at a time when most roadside stops offered one soft-serve option from a machine that had not been cleaned recently. Families planned their driving days around Howard Johnson's stops the way a later generation planned them around gas station coordinates on a phone screen. The decline did not arrive suddenly. It arrived the way most cultural disappearances do, so gradually that nobody thought to document it while it was happening. Interstate highways got faster. Fast food chains built specifically for speed and low price began appearing at every exit ramp. McDonald's and Burger King offered something Howard Johnson's could not match on price or convenience. And the full sit-down service that had been a feature became a liability in a market where families increasingly wanted to eat in the car and keep moving. By the early 2000s, the chain was down to a handful of locations. By 2005, fewer than 8 restaurants remained. The final location, a single restaurant in Lake George, New York, closed quietly in June 2022, with no national press conference, no farewell campaign, and no acknowledgement from the brand that something historically significant had just ended. A chain that once served more highway meals than any other restaurant company in America disappeared without a single headline that most people ever saw. Number 6. Perkins Restaurant and Bakery. A family diner that has filed for bankruptcy multiple times across 2 decades and still has hundreds of locations open is proof that a restaurant can keep its lights on long after the business holding it together has already failed. Perkins opened its first location in Cincinnati in 1958 as a simple pancake house, and spent the following decades growing into something genuinely embedded in American family dining. The bakery case near the front door was its defining feature. Pies, muffins, and fresh pastries displayed under glass that gave every location a specific smell the moment you walked through the entrance. The breakfast menu was the anchor, but Perkins ran across all 3 meal periods and built a level of community loyalty in the Midwest and Southeast that most chains spend decades trying to manufacture. Regulars came every week, some came every morning. The kind of habitual loyalty that happens organically when a restaurant is consistent, affordable, and genuinely part of a community's daily rhythm. At its peak, Perkins operated more than 450 locations across the country. Then the financial cycle began, and it has not stopped since. The company filed for bankruptcy in 2011. It emerged and kept operating. It filed again in 2019. It emerged again and kept operating. Each restructuring closed underperforming locations, renegotiated debt, and returned the remaining restaurants to a state of functional uncertainty, while the same loyal customers kept showing up every week, without any reliable way to know whether their specific location would survive the next cycle. As of 2024, approximately 265 locations remained, a number that sounds like stability but represents decades of attrition. From a peak the brand has never come close to recovering. What the repeating bankruptcy pattern actually means for the people who depend on these restaurants is something the financial filings never capture. Every Perkins still open exists in permanent uncertainty. The staff who built careers there, and the regulars who built routines around it, have no way to know whether next year looks like the last 10 years or like the end. A diner that built its entire identity around being the reliable, dependable place your family came back to every Sunday has spent 20 years operating in a condition that is the precise opposite of reliable and dependable. The pies in the case are still fresh. The business baking them has already failed twice and is running on borrowed time it has already run out of before. Number 5. Shari's Cafe and Pies. A Pacific Northwest diner that once operated 95 locations across 6 states closed every single Oregon restaurant overnight without telling its employees, and by the time the parent company filed for bankruptcy in 2026, only 8 locations remained standing. Shari's was the kind of diner that Pacific Northwest families grew up treating as a permanent fixture. Open 24 hours, booths along the windows, a pie case that rotated seasonal flavors through the year, and a breakfast menu that covered every possible combination of eggs, pancakes, and hash browns at any hour of the night. The chain had been a consistent presence across Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and California for decades. Not trendy, not glamorous, just reliably open and reliably affordable for the families, night shift workers, and late-night diners who needed exactly that specific combination at exactly that specific hour. In October 2024, every single Shari's location in Oregon closed simultaneously without any advance warning. Employees arrived for their scheduled shifts and found the restaurants locked. No announcement had been made to staff. No notice had been posted to customers. The Oregon Lottery later revealed that the company owed approximately $900,000 in lottery terminal revenue it had collected inside its restaurants but never forwarded, and that checks it had already written had bounced weeks earlier due to insufficient funds. The closure was not an orderly business wind-down. It was the result of a company that had already run out of money long before anyone outside its own accounting department knew it. The parent company, Lena Brands LLC, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in May 2026. By that point, only 8 Shari's locations remained in operation across Washington and Idaho, down from 95 restaurants that had served the Pacific Northwest for decades. Employees at the Oregon locations found out they no longer had jobs the same morning the customers found out they no longer had a diner. No severance conversation. No transition plan. Just a locked door on a Sunday morning in a region that had treated that specific restaurant as part of the permanent landscape of daily life for longer than most of its employees had been alive. Number 4. Smoky Bones. A barbecue chain that once had more than 120 locations across the country filed for bankruptcy in January 2026, told its customers and employees it was restructuring, kept every remaining restaurant open for 3 months, and then shut down every single one of them on the same day without any public notice. Smoky Bones built a genuinely loyal following in the American casual dining space over nearly 30 years. Smoked meats, slow-cooked ribs, pulled pork, and the kind of barbecue that requires time and attention to do properly. The atmosphere was deliberately relaxed. Sports on every screen, long communal tables. A place where a group could settle in for 2 hours without anyone making them feel like they were taking up space someone else needed. In markets across the eastern United States, the chain had built the kind of regulars that only arrive when a restaurant is consistently worth returning to. People who came back specifically because the food was the same every time, and the experience never tried to be something it wasn't. At its peak, Smoky Bones operated more than 120 locations. The erosion started in 2025 when 15 underperforming restaurants closed, as the company tried to stabilize its finances by cutting the weakest locations from the network. In January 2026, it filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy and made a public commitment to keep its remaining 31 restaurants open, while new ownership or additional financing was arranged. Customers at those 31 locations kept coming in through February, March, and most of April. The dining rooms were full. The food was being served. The staff was showing up and doing their jobs with no indication that anything was fundamentally different from any other week. On April 27, 2026, with no public announcement to customers and no adequate notice to employees, Smoky Bones ceased all operations at every remaining location simultaneously. The final day of service was April 28th. 3 months after a public bankruptcy filing that promised survival, every restaurant went dark in a single day across the entire country. The employees who had stayed loyal through the uncertainty, continuing to serve customers while the company worked through its restructuring, lost their jobs in the same abrupt manner the customers lost their restaurant. No farewell service. No last night. Just a statement posted online after the doors were already locked. Number 3. Bahama Breeze. A Caribbean restaurant that Darden Restaurants built from a single Orlando location in 1996 and operated for nearly 30 years, was written off in a February 2026 press release, and every one of its 28 locations stopped serving food by April 5th of the same year. Bahama Breeze filled a space in American casual dining that almost nothing else came close to replicating. The Caribbean atmosphere was specific and it was consistent across every location. Island-inspired cocktails made with real fruit. Fresh seafood prepared in a style that genuinely tasted different from the standard casual dining menu. Open architectural elements. A soundtrack and a visual environment that made a serious attempt at transporting you somewhere warmer and further from the parking lot outside. For families and groups who wanted a dining experience that felt like an occasion without the price point of a fine dining restaurant, Bahama Breeze delivered something reliable and genuinely enjoyable that its loyal customers could not easily find anywhere else. Darden Restaurants, the parent company behind Olive Garden and Longhorn Steakhouse, had carried Bahama Breeze since its founding and watched it grow to 28 locations across the country. Then inflation compressed margins across the casual dining sector in a way that smaller portfolio brands felt far more severely than anchor brands with thousands of locations. Bahama Breeze's 28 restaurants, running a more complex and ingredient-intensive menu than a standard casual chain, became increasingly difficult to operate profitably in an environment where every input cost had risen significantly. The announcement in February 2026 described the closure as the completion of a strategic alternatives review, clinical language for the permanent end of a 30-year-old brand with loyal customers in every market it served. All 28 locations closed by April 5, 2026. The concept that had been a genuine outlier in American casual dining, a chain that actually delivered a specific and transportive experience rather than a safe variation on whatever everyone else was already doing, became a line item on a quarterly earnings call. For the communities where those 28 restaurants operated, it was the only place within a reasonable distance that offered that specific experience. Now there is simply nothing to replace it. Number 2. Village Inn. A breakfast diner that two brothers-in-law opened on a Denver street corner in December 1958, has been quietly losing locations for years, while most of the country outside its home markets has no idea it ever existed at all. Village Inn started as a single pancake house at 8855 East Colfax Avenue in Denver, Colorado, launched by Jim Mola and Merton Anderson 6 days before Christmas in 1958. The concept was straightforward and it worked immediately. A full breakfast at any hour served in a room that felt genuinely comfortable for a family, with 3 kids on a Sunday morning, or a table of retirees who had been meeting every Tuesday for 15 years, fresh pies in a rotating case near the entrance. A menu that covered every breakfast combination anyone had ever wanted without asking them to choose between ingredients they had never heard of. Village Inn never tried to be more than that, and in the markets where it established itself, particularly across Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and the broader Mountain West, that honesty built a loyalty that lasted generations. At its height, Village Inn operated more than 300 locations across the country. The parent company, American Blue Ribbon Holdings, filed for bankruptcy in 2020, and the chain lost multiple Colorado locations almost immediately. The Denver city that had given Village Inn its origin watched several of its front-range restaurants close in quick succession. Closures continued at a steady rate through 2025 and into 2026, with individual locations disappearing from markets that had relied on them for decades. By 2026, approximately 112 Village Inn locations remained in operation, representing a loss of roughly 2/3 of the chain's peak footprint. What makes the Village Inn story distinctly different from the bigger names on this list is the silence around it. When a Red Lobster closes, the news cycle picks it up. When a Village Inn closes, the town it served is often the only place that notices. A 60-year-old breakfast institution built by two brothers-in-law on a Denver street corner has been losing pieces of itself so quietly that the people in communities where it once operated sometimes drive to their usual location without realizing until they arrive that it has already been gone for months. Number 1. Red Robin. A sit-down burger chain that built genuine loyalty by actually trying to be a real restaurant rather than just a fast food stop with better lighting, has now sold 86 locations, closed dozens more, and announced plans to cut up to 70 restaurants from its network over the next 5 years. Red Robin was never competing with McDonald's, and it never tried to. It was doing something categorically different. A sit-down burger restaurant where the burger was genuinely the focus, and the experience around it was designed for people who wanted to actually stay. Bottomless steak fries that kept coming to the table without anyone having to ask. A menu wide enough to bring a family of 5 with completely different tastes and find something for every single one of them. Real table service from staff who checked back and refilled drinks without being flagged down. A dining room built for people to spend time in rather than cycle through as quickly as possible. For families who wanted something meaningfully better than a drive-thru but didn't want a reservation or a $40 entree, Red Robin occupied that middle ground with a consistency that built real, multi-generational loyalty over decades. As of December 2024, Red Robin operated 498 restaurants across the country. The company identified 70 underperforming locations in 2024 and announced a closure plan spread across 2025 through 2030. 23 restaurants closed in 2025. 30 more were sold to a franchisee group in June 2026 as part of a strategy to move the financial burden of operating those locations off the corporate balance sheet. Another 20 closures are expected before the end of 2026 as leases expire and the company continues evaluating which parts of its network are viable under current conditions. What is disappearing location by location is the specific kind of restaurant that became genuinely harder to find every year that passed. Not fast food, not fine dining, something honest in the space between that actually worked and actually delivered on the implicit promise that a family could come in, take their time, order what they wanted, and leave feeling like the meal was worth exactly what they paid for it. The 70 locations Red Robin has committed to closing do not represent a percentage to the families in those specific towns. They represent the end of the restaurant that was always the answer when someone in the car asked where to go, and everyone needed to agree. That kind of restaurant does not get replaced by something else. It simply stops existing and the space it occupied stays empty in a way that no other business ever quite fills. 12 restaurants, 12 different names, but the same pattern running underneath every single one of them. Red Lobster was hollowed out by its own supplier. Shoney's was fragmented by ownership changes that had no loyalty to the breakfast buffet or the communities built around it. Joanne was loaded with $1 billion of private equity debt and left to service it while competing in a market that was already changing faster than any physical retailer could adapt. The customers at nearly every restaurant on this list were still showing up, still ordering the same food they had ordered for 20 years. The loyalty was never the problem. What failed was the structure operating above the customer's head. The debt, the ownership transfers, the boardroom decisions made by people who had often never eaten a single meal in the restaurants they were deciding to close. These were not empty dining rooms when the closure announcements came. They were full of the same families who had always filled them. And that is what makes the disappearance of these chains something more than a business story. These were the places where ordinary American life happened, where the food was honest and the prices made sense and the booth in the corner was always open. They are closing not because Americans stopped wanting them, but because the businesses built around them were never designed to last as long as the people who loved them needed them to.